Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this first panel, where we will be discussing issues of imperialism, post-imperialism, Europeanism, and the political futures of Scotland. Let me take the time to introduce our first guest, Mariia Meyer. After graduating with a master's degree in English studies at the Université de Haute-Alsace in Mulhouse in 2019, Mariia began her PhD at the same university in September of the same year under the supervision of Professor Laurent Curilli. Her research is dedicated to the Scottish Conservative Party between 1997 and 2018, with reference to unionism and Scottishness. Since September 2019, she has been working as an English teacher at the University of Strasbourg. Mariia's paper analyzes the Scottish Conservative and Unionist parties' imperialism and the shift towards Europeanism. Mariia, thank you very much for joining us today. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much for introducing me, and thank you so much for the opportunity to speak at the conference. To be honest, it's my first one as a PhD student, so well, fingers crossed it will be okay. So I'm gonna share my screen, so just let me know if that works correctly, because sometimes, as we know, there are some technical issues, but hopefully it won't happen. Okay, yeah, I guess it works. Right, so as Amal told, I will be presenting the Scottish Conservative and Unionist parties' imperialism and the shift towards Europeanism. So in 1707, Scotland and England formed, as often called, a fruitful union between two equal partners and a marriage of convenience. Under the Treaty of Union, Scotland and England dissolved their national parliaments and formed one sovereign Westminster Parliament in London. The two kingdoms had different interests at stake. For England, the union with Scotland were the means of ensuring security in the north, which was otherwise undermined by Jacobites. And for Scotland, this union guaranteed access to British imperial market where Scottish manufacturers could trade freely without being punished by higher tariffs. Within the empire, Scottish trading possibilities expanded to such an extent that by the time of the American War of Independence, several parts of British North America and the West Indies had become virtually Scottish colonies. So we might say that the union with the Kingdom of England allowed Scotland to exploit its full economic potential at the price of its political sovereignty. The creation of the United Kingdom of Great Britain formed the basis for Britishness, so this new national identity on the British Isles. This happened in the context of and because of the British Empire. As John Gaskell affirms, the experience of inhabitants of the British Isles encountering large numbers of peoples very different from themselves served to give form to a common British identity. So as we can see, British imperialism was not only an economic bonanza, but also served as a catalyst for the creation of a political nation. The idea of a political nation applied to the British Empire and Britishness makes allowance for the fact that the United Kingdom cannot be called a nation state as it unites several nations. Of course, this raises the question of the definition of and distinction between a state and a nation. As these terms have been used interchangeably by scholars, their use might be quite confusing. Walker Corner, professor of political science, dedicates a whole chapter of his book, Ethno-Nationalism, The Quest for Understanding, to these terms. So he admits that defining and conceptualizing the nation is much more difficult because of the essence of a nation is intangible. Whereas the state can be easily defined as it is easily conceptualized in quantitative terms, such as population, the size of its territory, and its geographical location. Drawing from this idea, the state is a political unity rather than a psychological understanding and feeling of belonging of one group of people. And the nation is a self-defined rather than an other-defined grouping, so it will seldom accord with factual data. For this reason, it is possible to claim that the nation may well be imagined or even artificially created in a specific context when a unifying ideology is applied. British national identity might serve as an example of and a proof of such a claim. In the context of British imperial expansion, the various kingdoms of the British Isles were brought together into one political unity. However, having that this British identity is not necessarily contrary to having a sense of Scottish, among others, identity as well. People often have various identities and understandings of their belongings. In the context of the United Kingdom, it was quite possible for an individual to see himself as being at the same time, a citizen of Edinburgh, a lowlander, a Scot, and a Briton. So Britishness has been and still is an artificial national identity. Kummer calls it imperial nationalism or missionary nationalism. He asserts that the key feature of what he's calling imperial or missionary nationalism is the attachment of a dominant or core ethnic group to a state entity that conceives itself as dedicated to some large cause or purpose, it might be religious, cultural, or political. So drawing from what I've mentioned before, even economic interests of one country may well be projected onto its sense of nationhood, transforming or even creating a sub or supranational identity which coexists with its core sense of self. Political parties play a crucial role in the process of creation of and maintaining a new identity. The British Conservative and Unionist Party was the main political actor defending the empire. The concept of unionism is linked to imperialism and economic protectionism, which was on the Conservatives' agenda under tariff reform at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, designed to impose preferential tariffs on goods from outside of the empire. So in my talk today, I intend to show how this policy aimed at welding British national and imperial identity. With gradual decolonization, the Conservative Party had to find a replacement to its strong support for imperialism. The concept of unionism, as we know it today, was formed when the risk of the UK's disintegration grew at the end of the 19th century with Ireland. However, when the UK joined the European Union in 1973, a new supra-state level was added to multiple layers of the conservative thought. Though the Conservative Party counted some Eurosceptics among them, the official party stance was pro-European. The 2016 Brexit referendum and its campaign, in which the Scottish Conservative Party advocated for Remain side of the debate, allow me to suggest the connection between the party's imperialism in the past and Europeanism in the present. So the first part of my presentation will not focus on general conservative policies under the empire, but rather on a specific protectionist policy, which is tariff reform, to pinpoint the connection between the conservatives' perception of the national identity and their economic policy. In the second part, I'll see how imperialist protectionism transformed after the end of the empire and the UK's integration into the European Union from the Conservative Party's perspective, before finally zooming in on the Scottish Conservative Party's Europhilia as expressed in its support for the Remain side of the debate in the Brexit referendum in 2016. Not much research covered tariff reform, but it clearly shows its economic side and how it had been dividing the Conservative and Unionist Party with its liberal Unionist allies. Today, I aim at neither covering this divide nor the policy's economic aspirations. My main interest lies in this policy's underlying Unionist ideas, which may be found through analysis of its economic side. From the 19th century onwards, British missionary nationalism led to raised awareness of the need for social reform in British society to keep up with the demands of the empire. The Conservative Party quite often equated imperialism with patriotism, and the fact that the British Empire was the fruit of the common effort of the British people was used by it to advocate for the creation of a protected imperial market as opposed to free trade. The most famous and controversial imperial policy aimed at the creation of this protected imperial market proposed by Joseph Chamberlain in 1903 and supported by many conservatives was tariff reform. The Unionists sought to attract newly enfranchised working class voters and appeal to their usual electorate of landowners at the same time. It was evident that the Conservatives had to face at least two major problems. The first one, as the party of empire, they had to face up to the apparent decline of Britain's imperial predominance, and as the party of property, they had to try and defuse the challenge of socialism for the first time. So Tariff reform's aims may be summarized as follows. The first aim is to call for British people's imperial sentiment through imperial preference. The second aim is to appeal to working classes by advocating economic protection, expanded imperial market, and the promise of secure employment. The third aim is to treat the consumer interests, and the last one is to cover costs for social reform without necessarily raising taxes. As we can see, these aims are mostly economic, right? They reflect mostly economic goals. So it is important to see that imperial unity, which also lay at the heart of this reform, is quite often overlooked. So Thomson argues that Chamberlain believed that the preferential tariff was the most attractive and plausible form of imperial union, and that imperial unity offered the best solution to the major social and economic problems of the day. A great deal of information can be taken from Joseph Chamberlain's speech delivered in Glasgow in 1903, in which he explained his proposals on tariff reforms. So he stated the aims or objects of these reforms as follows. So I quote, he said, "In the first place, we all desire the maintenance and increase of the national strength and the prosperity of the United Kingdom. That may be a selfish desire, but in my mind, it carries with it something more than just mere selfishness. You cannot expect foreigners to take the same views as we of our positions and duty. To my mind, Britain has played a great part in the past in the history of the world, and for that reason, I wish Britain to continue." End of quote. In this part of his speech, Joseph Chamberlain refers to Britain as the world power, emphasizing its world leadership and not solely in the empire. Outsiders are called foreigners who are not capable of taking the same views as British people, and therefore they cannot expect them to do so. So on the one hand, this may be interpreted as an attempt to call for people's imperial feelings and make them feel more sophisticated than foreigners. And on the other hand, it sounds like a hidden warning about the possible future of the United Kingdom, should it not continue to play a great part as a world power. Colonists were here to help Britain to do so. So in the same speech, Joseph Chamberlain said, "Then in the second place, our object is or should be the realization of the greatest ideal which has ever inspired statesmen in any country or in any age, the creation of an empire such as the world has never seen. We have to cement the union of the states beyond the seas. We have to consolidate the British race." End of quote. Chamberlain's mention of the British race and the union of the states beyond the seas leads us to ponder on the issue of British identity. As the British Empire created Britishness, its solidification and maintenance are part of this political identity. As a Unionist, Chamberlain saw the British race in the very existence of the empire. This fact links the Unionists' economic aspirations to their understanding of their national identity. Economic protectionism through preferential tariffs was a way to strengthen the ties between the United Kingdom and its colonies. However, as tariff reform lacked public support and caused division in the Conservative Party, Joseph Chamberlain was forced to change this policy and gradually abandon his imperial doctrine. So in 1912, the Liberal Unionists and the Conservative Party merged, forming the modern Conservative and Unionist Party. Though the party had never been united over tariff reform, it could still demonstrate its imperial cause. Green regards tariff reform as a domestic policy, while Thomson sees it as an attempt to preserve the unity of the empire. Regardless of this difference, they both agree that it was a purely economic policy. However, they ignored the issue of identity linked to this tariff reform. The expansion of the British Empire and Britain's image as a world power associated with it added to the political identity or political nation. That is why protectionism should not be regarded as a solely economic notion. It was instrumental in sustaining and promoting the image of the United Kingdom and, as a consequence, British national identity. Joseph Chamberlain wanted not only to fund social reform by taxing the foreigner, but to defend his artificial political nation or British race. So now we shall see how imperialist protectionism transformed after the end of the empire. So when the empire fell apart in the second half of the 20th century, the understanding of Britishness had to be redefined as well. The post-imperial notion of British national identity, as understood by the Conservative and Unionist Party, amounted to the unity of the British Isles. With Ireland becoming an independent country in 1922, it was important for the party to preserve the union with Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. Andrew Bonar, who was leader of the Conservative Party and who was inspired by Joseph Chamberlain's political views, channeled the enthusiasm and frustration of his party into a coherent unionist strategy. So for the Conservatives in the 20th century, unionism and Britishness went hand in hand. But in the post-1950s period, the Conservative Party became the English Party. This change is quite important for the understanding of the history of the Scottish Conservative Party. Being part of the bigger British Conservative Party, which came to be seen as English rather than British, it dramatically suffered from this change. As a result, it had to develop a multifaceted identity, being at the same time British and Scottish. To these, a third artificial identity was added with time, Europeanism. Joining the European Union in 1973 favored the development of a supranational political identity in Scotland. Of course, at the end of the 20th century, the Conservatives had many Eurosceptics, including Margaret Thatcher and John Major, under whom it had been beaten the English drum, defying Scots nationals, Europeanists, and multiculturalists. But later in the 21st century, the official party stance became pro-European. The Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party emerged as an independent Scottish political party only in 2011, when Ruth Davidson became the first distinct party leader. Under her lead, the party developed its Scottish and not English identity, combining it with Britishness and Europeanism. So piecing together these three identities proved to be extremely challenging in the context of the 2014 Scottish independence referendum organized by the SNP-led government and the 2016 Brexit referendum when Britain decided to leave the European Union. During the Brexit referendum, the Scottish Conservatives advocated remaining in the EU. Of course, I should clarify what I'm saying and mention that the official position of one political party doesn't necessarily reflect on all members' personal opinion on the issue. So to illustrate this point, we might remember that during the Brexit referendum campaign, David Cameron, the British Conservative Party leader and Prime Minister at that time, supported the Remain side of the debate, while Boris Johnson, the former mayor of London at that time and a member of the British Conservative Party, backed the Leave vote in the referendum. So arguably, the perception of the official position of a party comes from the party apparatus. So I will use the term official party position when referring to party leaders' opinion on Brexit. So the official stance adopted by the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party in the EU referendum was a firm and convincing Remain. During the BBC Great Debate, Ruth Davidson, the Scottish Conservative Party leader, gave compelling reasons for maintaining the UK's membership in the European Union. She accused the Leave camp of lying about the economic disadvantages of EU membership. She also warned that if people decided to leave the EU, it would cost someone else their job, when speaking about the impact of leaving the EU on businesses and organizations. This warning counterbalanced the Leave campaign assumption that migration from Europe costs Britain and British people their jobs and money, as the EU's migrant crisis is out of control, as it was claimed by the Leave campaigners. To give another counter argument to immigration and job problems, which the Leave campaign insisted on, Ruth Davidson emphasized the fact that the European Union single market is the biggest single market in the world, and leaving it would be a big mistake. Putting the Unionist side of the Scottish Conservative Party forward, Ruth Davidson did not speak about Scotland in particular, but about Britain in general, saying that, and I quote, "A Britain she knows, the Britain she loves, works together with its friends and neighbors, and it doesn't walk away from them." End of quote. These words were said at the closure of the BBC Great Debate. So instead of repeating the benefits and advantages of staying in the EU, Ruth Davidson adopted a more personal attitude towards British voters. The words friends and neighbors go far beyond the notion of a country. They help people to project themselves more intimately into the debate regarding the EU. Because it's true that it's much easier for people to perceive the importance of their decision when imagining how this decision would affect their close environment, that is to say their family, friends, and the communities they live in. Even though in Ruth Davidson's speech, friends and neighbors referred to member states of the European Union, the words were used to influence her audience personally. So it is now time to draw some conclusions from my presentation. As the party of the empire, the Conservatives saw the strength and the future of the UK in the empire, as they believed that the answers to Britain's problems could be found in the unity with its colonies. They gave a great significance to Britain's place in the world and projected its fortunes into their perception of the British national identity. Even though tariff reform is often seen as a solely economic policy by other scholars, its underlying identity position should not be overlooked. Well, logically, when the empire was over, the Conservative Party could no longer stick to their guns on seeing Britishness as an imperial identity. It then shrank into the union with within the British Isles. And after joining the European Union with its single market and free trade, economic benefits of international union could once again be translated into creation of a new supranational political identity of being European. Of course, we should not regard the Conservative Party's imperialism and Europeanism as the same thing. They're different on many points, and the two great differences is that first, they present a different view of Britain as a world power, and second, that Europeanism could hardly be called missionary nationalism, while imperialism had religious and civilizing cause from the point of view of the Conservative Party. However, the idea of international union and economic cause behind it created the distinction between Europeans and others, which is exactly what happened under imperialist aspirations. In the modern world, the shift from imperialism towards Europeanism was essential for the Scottish Conservative and Unionist Party to preserve its presence on the British and, probably more importantly, Scottish political arena. So now, when the UK is out of the European Union after years of negotiations, the Scottish Conservatives seem to abandon their Europeanism in favor of the British Union, as they are today the main opponents of the second independence referendum, which was promised by the SNP. Thank you so much for your attention. Sorry, I guess we. Yeah.
I'm sorry. Thank you, Mariia, for this fascinating talk about the connection between imperialism and Europeanism from the lens of the Scottish Conservative Party. I'm sure we will get back to some of the issues you raised when we open the floor to questions. For now, I'm going to pass the floor on to our second speaker, who is Edwige Camp-Pietrain. Edwige is a professor of British Studies at the Université Polytechnique des Hauts-de-France. Her research is on contemporary Scotland, including politics, institutions, and public policies. She has published many articles on these topics. Her books include L'Écosse et la tentation de l'indépendance, le référendum d'autodétermination de 2014, and L'impossible indépendance écossaise. Edwige, we're very happy to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. Does it work? Yes. You can see my slide. Okay. So thank you to Melanie and to the organizers for the invitation. Scotland had not been an English colony. The Scottish Parliament negotiated its union with the British Parliament in 1707, and within the UK, Scotland didn't suffer from oppression. Yet in 1934, the SNP was founded, the Scottish National Party, with a commitment for Scotland as a nation to recover full sovereignty through lawful means. In 2014, the SNP was able to hold a referendum on independence allowed by the British government, but this had not been anticipated by the latter. So the rules had to be made up on that occasion, and they bore the mark of the SNP, which had succeeded in imposing its views in British politics over many decades, arguing that it would have to fight and win elections to gain a mandate that would enable it to negotiate with the British government before or after a referendum. And Brexit seems to have rekindled SNP prospects as a majority of the people of Scotland voted to remain in the European Union during the 2016 referendum. So I will thus contend that the SNP shaped the rules of a Scottish independence referendum with consistency while paying attention to shifting circumstances. Then it successfully held a referendum in 2014, which can now be regarded as a landmark. And nowadays, SNP leaders are trying to seize every opportunity in this Brexit process to gain permission for a second independence referendum. So first, SNP policies that shaped the rules over a Scottish independence referendum. Initially, the SNP didn't have any consistent set of policies. It was determined to secure independence through lawful means, and these means would soon be devised and appear in policy papers and manifestos. The first of these policy papers was published in 1946. The SNP reckoned that it would have to gain an overall majority of Scottish seats in the House of Commons, which would confer authority upon its members of Parliament to demand a Scottish Constituent Assembly. This assembly would draft a constitution and submit it to the electorate in a referendum. So the referendum would be held afterwards. In 1967, in a paper called SNP and You, the word authority turned into the word mandate, and the word mandate is still used today. Then, from the late 90s, this program was intertwined with EEC membership. Until then, the SNP was supposed to be for European integration, but critical of the EEC, regarded as too centralized, too bureaucratic, and the terms of membership had been negotiated by the British government, supposed to favor English interests. But in the late 80s, in the early 90s, sorry, the single market was about to be created. The Maastricht Treaty had just been signed, and SNP leaders realized that with the European Union, an independent Scotland would not be isolated. Over the years, the SNP had been gaining ground. The SNP had its first MPs elected during by-elections in 1945 briefly, and then in 1967. But from 1970, it gained MPs at every general election. In October 1974, it reached a peak of 11 Scottish seats out of 71 in the House of Commons, with 30% of the vote. The SNP's nationalism was based on economic matters. The Scots should get full control over their resources, and this claim was boosted by the discovery of oil in the North Sea, mostly off the Scottish coast in the late 60s, early 70s. But afterwards, in the 80s and in the 90s, the SNP never exceeded 6 MPs. In response to the SNP's breakthrough, British parties, especially Labour, which was then dominant in Scotland, devised devolution, that is to say, an advanced form of decentralisation, as a means to offer a constitutional response short of independence. But in the 1970s, Labour was divided, but these divisions melted away in the 80s under Margaret Thatcher's governments that led free market policies that were deeply resented in Scotland. Some Scots published a claim of right for Scotland in 1988, which had historical references. It was based on the sovereignty of the people, supposed to be an old Scottish principle. The claim of right advocated the creation of a constitutional convention that would be representative of the people to devise a scheme, a devolution scheme, and the constitutional convention was dominated by Labour. SNP politicians had contributed to the claim of right, but they refrained from taking part in the constitutional convention because it would focus on devolution. Nevertheless, SNP leaders, especially Alex Salmond from 1990, took into account the new context to reframe their plans. So the SNP then contended that the mandate for independence would result from the SNP gaining a majority of seats in the Scottish Parliament, in the new Scottish Parliament that was about to be set up. Yet Salmond and also his successor, John Sweeney, were both aware that some voters might be deterred from voting SNP if this meant achieving independence quite automatically. So from 2007, in their manifesto, they promised a white paper on independence that would be followed by a referendum whereby the people of Scotland would decide whether independence should be negotiated with the UK government. And this strategy proved successful because a growing number of voters turned to the SNP. The SNP thus came ahead of the 2007 election to the Scottish Parliament and formed its first government, which proved that it was fit to govern. And in 2011, it secured an overall majority of seats and thus a mandate to negotiate with the British government over the organisation of a referendum. So I'm moving on to my second part, the 2014 referendum. David Cameron was then Prime Minister, leader of the Conservative Party. He acknowledged this mandate, even though he was obviously opposed to Scotland's independence. But within his government, there were divisions over the strategy, there were hesitations and improvisation. Meanwhile, Alex Salmond, Scotland's First Minister, pressed the case for his referendum, buoyed by his mandate, and he imposed his own narrative. Eventually, an agreement was signed in October 2012 by both leaders, Cameron and Salmond. The Prime Minister endorsed a referendum on independence through a Section 30 order based on the Scotland Act 1998, which had created the Scottish Parliament. The power to hold the referendum that belonged to British institutions would be devolved to Scottish institutions to enable them to organise one and only one referendum on one single issue, Scotland's independence. This referendum would have to be held before late 2014, and the British government was committed to accepting the outcome of the referendum. But the referendum would be organised in Scotland, and that was crucial. Indeed, the Scottish Parliament passed 2 acts with considerable leeway. One was about the electorate, and the Scottish Parliament seized the opportunity to grant the vote to young people from the age of 16 and also to EU nationals living in Scotland. So they were able to promote their civic nationalism, putting emphasis on the people who lived in Scotland and not on Scottish people. The second piece of legislation was about the referendum itself, setting the date of the referendum and the question, which was, should Scotland be an independent country? A question devised after consulting the British Electoral Commission. And the second piece of legislation also dealt with the rules of the referendum, with two umbrella campaigns, which had become quite traditional in British politics. On the 18th of September 2014, well, independence was rejected, as you know. However, 44.7% of voters cast a vote in favor of an independent state, and this was a major achievement for the SNP. Independence had never been supported by more than 30% of respondents in opinion polls, so the campaign had been quite effective. And in addition, turnout was very high. Oh, sorry, there are commas instead of dots, sorry, 84.6%. Turnout was a resounding success. The Scots hadn't called for this debate, but they found it very interesting. After the 2014 referendum, the SNP became increasingly popular in Scotland. It won a majority at every election as a party prepared to defend Scottish interests. That is, elections to the elections to the Scottish Parliament, and also elections to the House of Commons. And the SNP replaced Labour as the largest party in terms of Scottish seats. At Holyrood, the SNP, Holyrood, that is the Scottish Parliament, the SNP lost its overall majority. However, it did retain a majority, and the SNP and the Greens, which are also committed to independence, do have an overall majority together. And this majority was slightly increased in the latest election led a month ago. So Nicola Sturgeon, who succeeded Alex Salmond as SNP leader and First Minister after the 2014 referendum, has been claiming that she has a mandate to hold a second independence referendum. This had not been anticipated in 2014. The matter was supposed to have been settled. However, Brexit has fueled the arguments put forward by the SNP. Indeed, 64% of the Scots voted against Brexit. And SNP politicians, like most Scottish politicians, argue that Brexit has been imposed on the Scots against their will. This is a real material change, because in 2014, Unionists encouraged the Scots to vote against independence to remain in the UK, a United Kingdom that was then in the European Union. Moreover, Scottish politics beyond SNP ranks Scottish politicians beyond SNP ranks blame the UK government for the way it has conducted the Brexit process. That is, the withdrawal negotiations, but also the negotiations over the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Indeed, successive British governments ignored the clear will of the Scottish Parliament to remain in the single market, to protect the full freedoms of the single market, including the free movement of people, as immigration is praised and has been praised in the Scottish Parliament. Whereas British politicians did grant a differentiated deal for Northern Ireland, to enable Northern Ireland to remain in the single market. But it is also argued in Scotland that British politicians, successive British governments have ignored the votes of the Scottish Parliament and the views of the Scottish government at every stage of the process. In addition, after Brexit, some powers are being re-centralised within the UK, which is also bitterly resented from a Scottish perspective. In late 2014, 19, the SNP government had a bill passed in the Scottish Parliament to regulate referendums, and it is now demanding from the UK government the power to organise a referendum on Scotland's independence. According to the SNP government, it should be the same as in 2014, especially as for the question, even if the Electoral Commission might now have different views after the 2016 referendum on Brexit. The Scottish government also published draft legislation to amend the Scotland Act 1998, legislation based on the sovereignty of the Scottish people, the right to self-determination that should be acknowledged by the British government. SNP leaders insist on the UK as a voluntary association of nations. Therefore, the UK government should make it easy for Scotland to become independent should the Scots vote in favour of independence. SNP MPs are still making references to claims of rights. In particular, well, as you can see quite recently in the House of Commons, knowing that these claims of rights have been endorsed by most Unionist politicians. In addition, the multi-party Smith Commission, which had been appointed by David Cameron shortly after the 2014 referendum to recommend additional powers for the Scottish Parliament, had refused to rule out a second independence referendum. This is the first quotation on the slide. And the Smith Commission, well, the report of the Smith Commission was signed by all Unionist parties. In the recent election campaign, elections to the Scottish Parliament, both the SNP and the Greens campaigned for a lawful second independence referendum, arguing that the UK government could not oppose the will of the people of Scotland, and both wanted an independent Scotland to join the European Union. Alba, which was a brand new party formed by Alex Salmond, the former First Minister, seemed prepared to break the law by organising a referendum, even if this process failed to be supported by the UK government. But Alba didn't gain any MSPs. So Nicola Sturgeon's cautious strategy seems to have been vindicated. Yet, well, Nicola Sturgeon also has opinion polls in mind, and public opinion in Scotland remains bitterly divided. It is by no means certain that the SNP could win a second independence referendum. The proportions of respondents prepared to vote for independence is pretty close to the proportion of people rejecting independence, and there are still people who don't know how they would vote, even if they don't appear on this slide. Meanwhile, the Scottish Conservatives, who had turned the second independence referendum into an issue in the latest election, remained the second largest party at Holyrood, but far behind the SNP. And they merely succeeded in further polarising the debate in Scotland. As for Boris Johnson, after the latest Scottish election, he ruled out another referendum, still insisting on the fact that the matter had been settled in 2014 and putting emphasis on the benefits of the UK for Scotland, especially during the pandemic and even as a result of Brexit. So in conclusion, well, the way the 2014 referendum was conducted seems to have become a set standard for self-determination in Scotland. The circumstances owed much to SNP views and to David Cameron's pragmatism, or some may say to his arrogance, as he was quite convinced that he would win the referendum that he had allowed. But the UK government did not legislate after the 2014 referendum to regulate referendums in the future. So the SNP still intends to take advantage of this precedent in the aftermath of Brexit. The pandemic has put their claims on hold, and it is now being exploited by both sides to explain either that Scotland should handle the recovery on its own, or that it is better protected by the UK. Brexit could work both ways for a second independence referendum. Indeed, it is estimated that about 1/3 of SNP voters voted for Brexit. So during a second independence referendum, voters in favor, voters would have to choose, in fact, between two unions, the UK or the EU. The Brexit process has proved that real difficulty of breaking a union, of disentangling a union, and yet the EU is far looser than the United Kingdom. Moreover, Scotland would have to apply to join the European Union as an outsider. And if Scotland succeeded in joining the EU, then this would create a hard border between an independent Scottish state and the rest of the UK. So two main differences compared to 2014. From an economic point of view, Brexit is supposed to result in lower economic growth for Scotland. So the economic case for Scotland is not bright either, again, contrary to 2014. Nevertheless, Nicola Sturgeon remains optimistic, hoping to hold a second independence referendum within the next few years. She remains consistent with previous SNP policies, advocating self-determination to enable the people of Scotland to run their own affairs with their own values, to run their own affairs as a normal nation. But the Scots, or the people of Scotland, are in no hurry to have such a deeply divisive debate once again in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwige, for this very fascinating presentation about the practicalities underlying a potential second independence referendum in Scotland, drawing lessons from the first 2014 consultation. Do we have any questions at this point from the audience? No? Okay. So I thought both your presentations are extremely interesting and also complementary. Mariia has focused on the influence of empire, devolution, and EU membership on the Scottish Conservative Party's formation, while Edwige in turn has focused on the ways in which the practices used in 2014 could inform a new referendum. My first question to both of you would be, how have the mutually exclusive objectives of these two political forces in Scotland interacted with each other in the wake of Brexit? The Conservative, the Scottish Conservative Party and the SNP in view of their mutually exclusive objectives. I'm not sure if my question is clear.
I probably will try to answer to your question. If I understand it well, you mean during the Brexit referendum, how they worked together?
How they were opposed, how active the Scottish Conservative Party has been in countering the pro-independence agenda of the SNP.
During the Brexit referendum, or?
Up to this day.
Okay, well, the Scottish Conservatives, they're always have been opposed to independence, and from the devolution years, it was their kind of main policy in Scotland. But from the period when Labour politicians said that they were quite open to the question of independence and they might actually adopt the independence should it come, the Scottish Conservatives were always opposed to devolution, and this is why later on in their political manifestos they asked for Scottish people for their vote actually as an opposition party in Holyrood, as in the second presentation was said that there is the second biggest party, even though the SNP had many, still has much more votes in Holyrood than the Scottish Conservatives. But anyways, I think that their opposition to independence and their unionism in this case helped them actually to campaign during the Brexit referendum as well. Because, well, they were pro-European. They clearly stated that they didn't want Scotland to leave, they didn't want Britain to leave the European Union. But later on, they actually joined the British choice, the choice of the whole British people, right? If we're not talking about England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland individually. But so they were claiming and they were advocating for a soft Brexit with the UK still staying and remaining in the European single market, as opposed to the hard Brexit or no deal Brexit at all. And I actually think that during the Brexit referendum, they were not, so the Scottish Conservatives were not opposed to the SNP because they actually worked together as their views were both remain, even though some Scottish Conservative politicians were actually advocating for leave vote. But still, again, the official party stance was remain. So I would say that during the Brexit referendum, they were complementary. And during the 2014 independence referendum, of course, they were on different sides of the debate. And well, the SNP, I guess this is Professor Camp-Pietrain, which is more competent probably than me on this issue.
Well, just like to add something about the Scottish Conservatives. In fact, well, as you said, they did become the second largest party at Holyrood, but that was after the 2014 referendum. And they became the second largest party, replacing Labour, because they put emphasis on their opposition to a second independence referendum. So since the 2014 referendum, the Scottish Conservatives have been further polarising the political debate in Scotland, whereas Labour would have liked to move on. As for the 2016 referendum on Brexit, well, it's quite striking that a few weeks before the referendum, there was a motion passed in the Scottish Parliament by almost all MSPs, including Conservative MSPs, in favour of the European Union, in favour of continuing membership of the European Union. So the result of the referendum UK-wide was quite embarrassing for the Scottish Conservatives, to say the least. Ruth Davidson had succeeded in making her party much more popular, and then there were these results. And so soon after the referendum, Nicola Sturgeon, who wanted to who was quite prepared and who wanted to show that she was prepared compared to the British government. Well, there was no British government for a few weeks, and the Leavers hadn't any proper strategy. So Nicola Sturgeon had motions passed in the Scottish Parliament to demand protections for Scotland, protections for the way the Scots had voted in favour of EU membership, and also protections for Scotland's place in the single market, including the 4 freedoms, as I said in my presentation. And Nicola Sturgeon succeeded in gaining the support of a majority of MSPs, and the Scottish Conservatives, who were really embarrassed, abstained instead of rejecting these motions. But as the month went by, and especially in January 2017, when Theresa May clearly stated that the UK as a whole would leave the single market and the customs union, well, it became much more difficult for the Scottish Conservatives to continue to appear as if they were supporting Scottish government motions. And well, the Scottish government would have liked the Scottish Conservatives as the second largest party in the Scottish Parliament to put pressure on successive British governments to obtain a specific status, a differentiated deal for Scotland within the Brexit process, but they failed, and obviously SNP politicians were quite keen on putting emphasis on this failure. But there was a second important issue, which is that as a result of Brexit, some powers would be repatriated from Brussels to London, and some of these powers were related to devolved fields such as agriculture or fisheries. And the Scottish government, like most Scottish politicians, wanted all these powers in devolved fields to be immediately devolved to the Scottish Parliament, whereas the British government wanted to retain some of these powers at Westminster for a few years to create an internal market within the UK. The Scottish Conservatives succeeded in having the British government reduce the number of such powers at stake. But nevertheless, nowadays, there are still some of these repatriated powers in devolved fields, which will be which will be run by the British government and Parliament for a few years. So obviously, since 2016, SNP politicians have repeatedly claimed that the Scottish Conservatives had betrayed the interest of their constituents.
Thank you very much, Edwige. I'm sorry, I think I have another question for you. And it is, to what extent do you think that a second independence referendum in Scotland could bring a sense of ending? And I'm thinking here of the term of neverendum that was previously used by Stuart.
Well, as I said in my presentation, the Scottish government wanted to avoid neverendums, and obviously the British government had similar views before 2014. Indeed, the Edinburgh Agreement signed in 2012 was clearly an agreement for one and only one referendum, and only on Scotland's independence. And both governments were prepared to support the outcome of the referendum. So the matter was supposed to have been settled. So that was the agreement. But in addition, Unionist politicians added that there should not be two referenda within a generation, so supposedly 25 years. So this has become another time limit. So obviously 2014 plus 25 is definitely not 2021. And this argument is very often used nowadays. But of course, SNP politicians have another powerful argument: Brexit, a major game changer for Scotland, affecting many areas of political life in Scotland. I don't really have any proper answer. I think there's no answer to your question. Neferendums were not supposed to happen in Scotland, and the examples of Quebec had been studied and rejected. But then again, as I said also in my presentation, the British government, British governments would have had plenty of opportunities to legislate for other potential independence referendums since 2014. And they have decided against, legislating. So, well.
Thank you very much, Edwige. Thank you very much. Anyone would like to ask a question? We still have, I think, 10 minutes left. No? Okay, so I have another question.
Stuart has a question, I think.
Yes, please go ahead.
Thanks a lot. I just had to unmute myself. Yeah, thanks for two very interesting papers. I've just got a question for Mariia. I thought that was really interesting what you're doing, and it intersects with a lot of things that I've dabbled with over the years. Just want to take the proposition that you put on the screen as a general proposition that protectionism was instrumental in sustaining and promoting the British national identity. And obviously I understand, what you're fundamentally basing that on. You showed us some of the rhetorical evidence for that, and I'm well aware that there's loads more where that came from. And so you'll find any number of instances, particularly in that particular turn of the century era, where tariff reformers are talking very much to sort of the language of organic union, and that the goods, the goods, the articles of commerce are bound up in the idea of an organic and shared Britishness. But my question is, how do you sort of square that statement? If we leave it at that, if we were to leave it at that, how do you square that statement with the fact that the issue itself was so controversial, that it was the political issue, it was the key fault line, if you like, in British political culture at the turn of the 20th century. And of course you had the 1906 election is often regarded as a sort of a landslide in favor of the opposition. People like Frank Trentman have really almost made the opposite claim. Trentman claims that free trade was the closest modern Britain ever came to a national ideology. So he seems to be he's ploughing the same furrow as you. He's interested in the interface between commerce and ideas of collective selfhood, but he's actually, tilting in the other direction. So I wonder if you try in your work to sort of, square that with what you're arguing. Another book that might be worth just mentioning in that context is David Edgerton's recent, not so recent now, it's a few years old, but The Rise and Fall of the British Nation, where he goes out of his way. I actually find it a little bit tendentious that every time an idea of a wider and wider still dimensions to British selfhood in the 20th century, whenever it comes up, he's at pains to talk it down, and he uses this unfortunate metaphor to trump that nation trumped empire. He says this about half a dozen times in the book, and he suggests that tariff reform, imperial preference, was always really just an aspiration. It was never really brought to fruition. I don't entirely agree with him, and I think that what you're ploughing is potentially fruitful. But I wonder how you think about these things and the kinds of people out there who might gainsay your argument. So that's my question.
Right. Thank you for this question. It's quite interesting. And of course, it's quite controversial how people viewed and how other political parties viewed this economic protectionism proposed by Joseph Chamberlain and backed by radical conservatives, right? They were called radical because, as I mentioned in my paper, not all conservative politicians supported actually this policy. And it is true that lots of scholars claim that the Conservative Party lost lots of members of parliament because of this policy as well. And actually, I'm not saying that this policy is 100% reflection of this national identity, I really look at it from this radical conservatives perspective, how they viewed this policy, how they perceived and why they advocated for this policy. Because for them, of course, there were lots of tariffs that had to be imposed on British citizens, and other political parties said to the voters that was like, if I'm not mistaken, they call it dairy food or something like that. So the food would cost much more expensive with those tariffs if imposed. There was corn tariffs as well, which were quite damaging for the British citizens. But viewed by those radical conservatives, these tariffs, they were worth imposing just to stay and to preserve this union with its colonies.
Thank you very much, Mariia. Any other questions? Okay, I would like to know, Mariia, how aligned has been the Scottish Conservative Party to the UK-wide Conservatives, and has it adopted a different policy position that could make that could set them apart from as a Scottish polity?
Right, they actually were the same political parties from the beginning. So they were liberal unionists who formed the party with conservatives in 1912. And the party was called Scottish Unionists, so they didn't use this conservative part. And at that time, they were quite attractive for Scottish voters. And after 1964, they actually dropped their unionist part and they took this conservative part. And from that, it was quite detrimental to their fortunes, because from that moment on, they were seen as like lairds and law agents in Scotland, and Scottish people didn't really like that. As I mentioned, it was the same political party. That is why they suffered a lot, because the British Conservatives were seen by other political parties as an English party, not even British party. And in Scotland, Scottish Conservatives were called anti-Scottish, which is, of course, quite bad for their reputation. And actually, when devolution was passed and voted for in a referendum in 1997, they decided that something had to be done. So they actually overcame some organizational changes. So they organized their first leadership contest in 1999 for the first Scottish Parliament election. But at that moment, the parties were still together. So there were no like two distinct conservative parties. It only happened in 2011 because they saw that it didn't really work. They could not really gain their members of parliament for Holyrood. And so at that time, they decided that they would be independent from the British Conservatives in terms of their own funding. So they do not share the same funding with the British Conservatives, even though they share the members of Parliament at Westminster. They also imposed the selection of party representatives, so those who could apply for the MSP's position. Before, when they formed the same party with the British Conservatives, Scotland was called a proving ground for Scottish Conservative party because apparently English politicians came to Scotland to represent the constituencies they have never seen before. So that was quite bad, again, for their reputation. People call them out of touch conservatives. So they changed that after 2011. So they imposed this way of selecting their members. They also actually passed different policies. So the policies were not the same as the British Conservative policies. They claimed and they understood, I think, that Scotland was quite much more socialist than the rest of the United Kingdom. So in their political manifestos, they advocated for the abolition of tuition fees at the universities, for example, and also state-funded care for the elderly. So this kind of policies.
Thank you very much, Mariia. Are there any last points or any last comments any one of you would like to make before we close?
Yes, please. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much to both of you for your papers. I was thinking back to what we were discussing this morning and in a way throughout about the links between Britain and empire, or Britain and post-empire. And I was rereading the other day the chapter by Stephen Howe about on Scotland and the end of empire. And of course, he makes the point that we all have to be very careful about when we look at what links there might be between processes of devolution and processes of decolonization. And some of the points he made, I mean, there's obviously the strong links that Scotland and the Scots have had with colonial expansion and the management of empire. But he was also emphasizing that, as far as he was able to find out, anti-colonialism tended to be largely based in England and possibly actually really sort of London centric or London based more than anything else, with some exceptions. And I was just wondering whether when you've looked at the details of the Scottish debates on both Brexit and the independence referendum, whether you found at all any connections, any sort of appeals to the lineage that Stuart was talking about this morning, to sort of previous experiences of liberation in some ways, or expression of the people's voice. I mean, bearing in mind, of course, that the Scottish case is very, very different from Malta or Cameroon or anything else. But I was wondering whether, even in terms of rhetoric, you'd found any sort of references to these precedents and to these debates.
Well, thank you for your question. Well, as for the SNP, I mean, I think I've been through most of their policy documents since the 1940s, and I haven't found any references to decolonization, anti-colonialism. No, they. As for SNP politicians, Scotland's case is different. Well, they did allude to the Commonwealth in the 30s when they didn't have any set of consistent policies yet. I found in some SNP papers that, an independent Scotland should join the Commonwealth to share the duties of England as mother countries. But after the war, absolutely nothing. In all the policy papers that I used to prepare my slides, I mean, like the 1946 statement or the 1967 SNP and U, or general election manifestos, there are no references to the empire or the Commonwealth. Really, in post-war years, absolutely nothing. Scotland is different. Scotland was not a colony. It didn't suffer from any oppression. And when SNP politicians, some SNP politicians were elected, for example, Winnie Ewing, who had won the first by-election or the second one in 1967, and who then won elections to the European Parliament, and she was an MEP for a long time. So she got involved with countries that had just become independent, but in fact she focused on their economic development. That was pretty clear. I mean, no, there's no, I haven't found any political writings related to anti-colonialism in, as for the SNP.
Any other questions? Okay, so I'm afraid this panel has now come to an end. I would like to thank our speakers for your brilliant contributions and the time you took to answer all of our questions. And I would like to thank you all for joining us